Imagine this. You wake up hungry. There is no fridge, no stored food, no quick breakfast. If no one works today, no one eats today. This was daily life in the time of Jesus Christ. And the food on the table, it didn't come easy. It came from hours of labor, from careful preparation, from a system built entirely around survival. Today, we're stepping into that world to understand exactly what people ate, how they prepared it, and why every meal mattered. In the first century, food was not about preference. It was about survival. People did not ask, "What do I feel like eating?" They asked, "What do we have? What can we make?" Because most families lived on the edge. Everything began with one thing: bread. Not as a side dish, but as the center of life. Morning, afternoon, evening, bread was always there. Because without bread, there was no meal. But bread did not come ready. First, grain had to be turned into flour, every single day. Inside the home, a stone mill was used. Grain poured in, then crushed by hand. Pushed, turned, pressed, again and again, until it became fine flour. This wasn't quick work. It took time, energy, strength, and it had to be done daily, because flour spoiled quickly. So if no one ground grain that day, there would be no bread. Once flour was ready, water was added. Slowly, carefully. The dough was kneaded by hand. No machines, no shortcuts, just experience passed down through generations. Then came the fire, a clay oven, known as a tanur. It burned hot, very hot. The dough was flattened and pressed directly onto the inner wall. Within minutes, it baked. But timing was everything. Too slow, it burned. Too fast, it fell into ash. Bread was not just food, it was also a utensil. There were no forks, no spoons. People used pieces of bread to scoop food, dip into broth, share meals. Bread was how they ate. Next came olive oil, not luxury, necessity. Olives were harvested, then crushed, pressed slowly, until oil flowed out. This oil was used for cooking, preserving food, adding flavor. Without oil, meals were incomplete. Wine was common, not for celebration alone, but for daily use. Water was not always safe, so wine was often diluted and consumed regularly. Grapes were crushed, left to ferment naturally, and stored in jars. Meat was rare, very rare. Most families could not afford it. It was reserved for festivals, special occasions. So what did they eat instead? Fish. Fish was accessible, especially near lakes and rivers. It was caught fresh, cooked simply, or dried for storage. For many, fish was the only consistent source of protein. A typical meal looked like this: bread, olive oil, legumes like lentils, fruits, figs, dates, grapes, sometimes fish. Simple, predictable, but enough to survive. And when you realize how much effort went into even the simplest meal, you begin to see this world differently. This wasn't just eating, this was survival. So if you want to keep exploring what life was really like in this time, take a moment to subscribe, because we're only just getting started. Food was too valuable to waste. Every grain mattered. Every drop of oil mattered. Because once it was gone, there was no replacement. Grain had to be stored carefully, in clay jars, baskets, small storage rooms. But even then, there were threats, pests, moisture, time, and even taxes. Cooking was done outside or near open spaces, because smoke filled homes quickly. Fire had to be watched constantly. Too much heat, food burns. Too little, it stays raw. The most important meal was in the evening, when work stopped. Families gathered and shared what they had. Not abundance, but enough. Because in this world, food was not guaranteed. Tomorrow's meal depended on today's work. And even with all this effort, all this preparation, all this careful planning, life remained uncertain. Because the real challenge was not just preparing food, it was making sure there would be enough. Again and again and again. Before a single meal could exist, before bread touched the table, before oil was poured, before wine was shared, everything began somewhere else, out in the fields, under the open sky, where survival depended on the soil and the mercy of the seasons. Because in the time of Jesus Christ, food was not prepared first, it was grown. And every step of that process was uncertain. Everything depended on the land: wheat, barley, olives, grapes. If the land failed, everything failed. There were no alternatives, no imports, no backup systems. There were no machines, no tractors, no advanced tools. Fields were plowed using wooden plows pulled by oxen or donkeys. The work was slow, heavy, and exhausting. Farming was not one person's job. It was everyone's responsibility. Men worked the fields. Women processed the harvest. Children helped wherever they could. Because survival required all hands. There was one thing no one could control: the weather. Rain had to come, at the right time. Not too early, not too late. If it didn't come, crops failed. Every season carried risk. Too much sun, the crops dried. Too much rain, they rotted. Strong winds could destroy everything. So people lived with something constant: silent anxiety. When crops finally grew, the work was not over. It was just beginning. Wheat had to be cut, gathered, separated by hand. After harvest, grain had to be prepared, husks removed, seeds cleaned. Every step took time, and every mistake meant loss. Even after all that work, nothing was secure. Grain was stored in clay jars, baskets, small barns, but threats remained: insects, moisture, decay. And then came external pressure from the Roman Empire. A portion of what families produced was taken, no matter how little they had. Olives were harvested carefully, then crushed, not once, but repeatedly, until the oil separated. This process required patience, pressure, time. And the result? A small amount of oil from a large amount of fruit. That oil was used daily, cooking food, preserving meals, lighting lamps. Without it, life became harder. Grapes were gathered, then placed in presses, often crushed by foot. Juice flowed out, collected, then left to ferment naturally. No chemicals, no control over outcome, only time. Wine was not instant. It took days, sometimes longer. And if something went wrong, the entire batch was lost. Milk did not last, so it had to be processed quickly. Goat milk was turned into simple cheese, yogurt. To prevent waste, nothing was used carelessly. Every decision mattered: how much to eat, how much to store, how much to save. Because once it was gone, there was no replacement. If one harvest failed, there was no safety net. Families could lose everything. Food shortages became real, and survival became uncertain. Everything connected back to food: work, time, energy, planning. Because without it, nothing else mattered. So when you look at a simple meal, bread, oil, wine, what you're really seeing is not simplicity. It's the result of labor, patience, and constant uncertainty. And yet, even after all this effort, one question always remained: how was this food actually eaten and shared every single day? And after all the labor, after the planting, the harvesting, the grinding, the fire, food finally reached the table. But even then, it wasn't as simple as eating. Meals were shared, not divided. Food was placed in a central dish, and everyone gathered around it. No individual portions, no separate plates, just one meal shared by all. People did not sit like we do today. They gathered low, often sitting on the ground, or reclining around a small table. Close, intentional. Because eating was not rushed. There were no forks, no spoons, no knives for eating. Bread became everything. It was torn by hand, then used to scoop lentils, dip into oil, pick up pieces of food. Bread was not just part of the meal, it was how the meal was eaten. Hands moved toward the same bowl, again and again. Dipping, scooping, sharing. This was normal, but it also meant something deeper. You only shared food like this with people you trusted. Eating together was not just about hunger, it was about connection, family, belonging. To share a meal was to accept someone. Not everyone was welcome at every table, because meals carried meaning. Eating with someone meant, you are part of my circle. We belong together. And that made every meal a social decision. There were rules, clear ones, about what could be eaten and what could not. Certain foods were avoided completely, because eating the wrong thing could make a person unclean. This wasn't just about health, it was about identity. Being clean meant you could worship, you could participate, you belonged. Being unclean meant separation. Everything was intentional. What was prepared, how it was eaten, who was present. Because every meal reflected belief, culture, survival. And when you start to see how even something as simple as eating carried this much meaning, you realize this world was far deeper than it looks. So if you're learning something new from this, take a moment to subscribe, because there's still more to uncover about how people truly lived. The most important meal happened in the evening, when the work was done, when the family returned. This was the moment to gather, to rest, to eat what had been prepared. The meal was not large, but it was enough. Bread, oil, lentils, fruits, sometimes fish. Everything placed together, everything shared. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers were rare, because every piece mattered. Every crumb had value. There was no rushing, no distractions, just eating, talking, being present, because meals were one of the few moments where life slowed down. This happened every day, not as luxury, but as necessity, a rhythm of life. Work, prepare, eat, repeat. Because when you understand how people ate, you understand how they lived. And when you understand how they lived, you begin to see their world clearly. In a world without abundance, without convenience, without certainty, a simple meal was never just a meal. It was the result of effort, the center of the home, and the difference between hunger and survival. And after seeing all of this, the labor, the preparation, the care behind every meal, it becomes clear. Food was never just physical, it carried meaning. Bread sustained life, every day. Without it, people struggled. So when people spoke about bread, they weren't just talking about food. They were talking about survival itself. Wine was part of daily life, but it also carried significance. It was present in gatherings, in meals, in moments of rest, a symbol of provision, of having enough. The table brought people together, family, friends, community. It was one of the few places where everything paused and people simply shared. In a world where nothing was wasted, even the smallest things mattered. Bread, oil, wine, simple elements, but essential ones. This was the world known by Jesus Christ, a world where bread had to be made daily, food required effort, meals brought people together. Nothing was abstract. Everything was real. Because understanding this world changes how you see everything. You begin to realize these were not just traditions. This was life. Bread was valuable. Oil was valuable. Wine was valuable. Not because they were rare, but because they required effort, time, patience. Today, food is fast, accessible, often taken for granted. But in that time, every meal told a story of work, survival, discipline. And maybe that's the difference. Back then, people understood the value of what they had because they knew the cost. So the next time you see bread, oil, wine, remember, these were not just simple foods. They were the foundation of life. In the time of Jesus Christ, food was not about luxury. It was about survival. It was about effort. It was about making sure there would be enough. And in that reality, every meal mattered. What part of this surprised you the most, or changed the way you see everyday food?